poem by William Carlos Williams. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold.
This is just to say was first published in 1934 and is set within a domestic context that could seemingly exist in just about any time period. Except, of course, for the fact that the speaker makes reference to an icebox instead of the more modern refrigerator. Nevertheless, the poem itself is essentially timeless, homing in on common but universal experiences that most people can readily relate to. Of course, this down-to-earth approach to subject matter was a hallmark of William Carlos Williams' poetry. Indeed, Williams wanted to zoom in on and celebrate those everyday aspects of life that human beings so commonly neglect, much to their detriment. Williams understood that in the simple experiences of life and in close observation of the world around us, our existence can be transformed into something far more deep, profound and rewarding. Williams is strongly associated with the American modernist movement in literature and saw his poetic outlook as a distinctly American one, seeking to renew poetry through the fresh, raw use of everyday American speech. In some ways, you could argue that without poets like Williams, who was influential on the Beat generation through his mentorship of poets like Allen Ginsberg, that later forms of American verse, such as rap even, would not have evolved at such a rapid rate in the 20th century. Williams wrote poetry for the people as he tried to make poetry less elitist and more accessible. Williams wrote about his concerns, stating that no one believes that poetry can exist in his own life. But in answer to his own problem, he also wrote, "The purpose of an artist, whatever it is to take life, whatever he sees, and to raise it up to an elevated position where it has dignity." Williams therefore sought to invent an entirely fresh and uniquely American form of poetry whose subject matter centered on everyday circumstances and events. This is just to say is a clear example of this completely unpretentious approach to writing. In fact, some experts take the poem as having been an actual note from Williams to his wife, which would therefore, in some ways, make the poem an example of something that's called a found poem. Whether this speculation regarding the poem's origin is true or not is hard to say, but regardless, the poem certainly makes the very commonplace act of having stolen some plums feel completely poetic. Williams himself was actually a medical doctor who worked during the day and indulged his passion for writing at night. He was also an important member of the Imagist movement, and this particular poem beautifully exemplifies many of the core qualities of Imagist poetry. In particular, the poem is a very simple poem about the ordinary act of eating plums, sneakily taken from the icebox. And it is this attempt to find beauty in such simplicity that ultimately aligns so perfectly with a poetic movement that's centered around the use of clear language and vivid, striking imagery. Finally, it is worth mentioning some of Williams's other famous poems, such as The Red Wheelbarrow, which, like This Is Just to Say, also meditates on a single image or event. In this case, however, Williams draws a scene that tells a story much like an artist or a painter would do when creating a still life painting. As such, Williams liked to use objects to communicate his ideas. Similarly, it would also be worth taking a look at his epic poem, Patterson, which features one of the poet's most famous lines, "Say it, no ideas but in things." This sentiment perfectly reflects Williams's commitment to exploring the beauty of the everyday in life, instead of getting bogged down by heady intellectual concepts, an approach that is on full display in this particular poem. The speaker. The poem's speaker is an unidentified person who has just eaten plums that were previously stored in an icebox. As the poem progresses, it becomes clear that the speaker wasn't supposed to eat these plums, since somebody else was saving them for breakfast. Even after acknowledging this transgression though, the speaker concentrates primarily on how delicious the plums actually were, thereby implying that any sense of guilt about having eaten the other person's food is overshadowed by the pure satisfaction of having eaten the plums in the first place, something it seems the speaker would most likely do again if given half the chance. Themes. Pleasure and guilt in everyday life. This is just to say can be understood as a poem about the simple pleasures of everyday life. In the grand scheme of things, the act of eating someone else's plums is not very noteworthy, yet the speaker seems to take great pleasure in having pinched and eaten the plums. Even though the speaker asks for forgiveness, it's dreadfully clear that the elation of consuming these delicious plums was far too great for them to say no to. Great enough to cancel out any genuine feelings of guilt. The cheekiness of the poem, in fact, written in the form of a note, actually accentuates the pleasure experience because the speaker now also has an audience to share the experience with. In other words, they are kind of gloating here, and you can kind of picture the twinkle in their eyes. From the title onwards, the speaker tries to find the right words to confess to this little act of thievery, but the apology, as we've seen, is a hollow act. Immediately after saying, "Forgive me," for example, the speaker goes on to talk about how delicious, sweet and cold the plums were, in a way justifying the thievery on the basis of how tempting the plums were. In this sense, the poem seems to suggest that nobody could possibly be upset with the speaker, given that the plums were so irresistible. And once again, you can almost see the twinkle in the speaker's eye here. The way the poem is written also gives the reader the sense of the lingering effects that the plums were having on the speaker as they wrote the poem. The poem is alive with real sensual feeling. The speaker is still thinking about how satisfying it was to eat the plums as they write, thereby indicating that any sense of guilt related to this act pales in comparison to the speaker's lasting delight. Thus, the poem isn't about an apology, but rather it is a celebration about the satisfaction to be had from experiencing the simple pleasure of eating a plum. The plums here therefore get transformed into something more profound than simple pieces of fruit. They become rich, delicious, bountiful treasures. One can almost picture the plums having been hidden away like a beloved object and chilled for that extra pleasure by the unseen person that the note is intended for. Rich, juicy and ready to consume. This is just to say uses the plums as a focus on commonplace things that Williams holds up to us for closer inspection, because in our lives of mass consumption, do we really linger on the many amazing pleasures we have access to in our day-to-day lives? Symbols, the plums. It can be argued that the plums in the poem represent any number of things, with a common interpretation being that they symbolise the speaker's inability to resist the allure of pleasure or satisfaction. Under this interpretation, the plums are simply too tempting for the reader to ignore, even though the speaker knows that someone else is saving them for breakfast. In a way, this might even be a subtle allusion to the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Bible, from which Eve eats the forbidden fruit and ushers in sin to the world. The act of eating plums is a transgression or sin of sorts, though it's clear that the speaker doesn't feel that bad about it. The poem then might even be taken as an extended metaphor about the general joys of indulgence and temptation, and even an argument against depriving oneself of the supposedly sinful luxuries of life. Then again, it's also entirely possible the plums aren't symbolic and are nothing more than, well, plums. This reading aligns with the fact that Williams was interested first and foremost in using straightforward, uncomplicated language and imagery in his poems. enjambment. One of the defining qualities of "this is just to say" is the speaker's use of enjambment, and the majority of the lines are divided by line breaks. This is noticeable on a visual level, since the poem consists of very short lines, and very few of these lines stand alone as their own complete phrases. In keeping with the fact that the speaker's phrases stretch across multiple lines, the poem lacks any kind of punctuation whatsoever. This, in turn, gives the lines a free-flowing feel that enhances the fluidity of the enjambment, which allows the speaker's words to sound relaxed and unhurried. At the same time, though, the enjambment in "this is just to say" also adds a certain measured sound to the poem, since the frequent line breaks slow reading down. Indeed, most of the lines aren't end-stopped, but there are moments in which there are small pauses that can be felt between two lines. For instance, the reader will perhaps sense a brief moment of delay between lines 5 and 6. Of course, there is no doubt that the line depends upon what follows in order for it to make sense, since it is an incomplete clause. And yet, the line break between these two parts of the phrase creates a brief but still noticeable pause that ultimately gives the speaker's words a contemplative sound. Indeed, it is almost as if the speaker is hesitant to acknowledge that the other person was most likely saving the plums for breakfast. In turn, the use of enjambment ultimately hints at the possibility that the speaker feels somewhat guilty for having stolen the other person's plums. It is also worth noting that in contrast to the rest of the poem, all the lines in the third stanza, "forgive me," to "and so cold," are end-stopped. This is because each line is capable of existing on its own, since perhaps, like "forgive me" and "they were delicious" are independent clauses. Of course, the lines "so sweet" and "so cold" aren't independent clauses, but they aren't enjambed because they don't necessarily flow into one another. Indeed, although there is no punctuation, the poem reads as if there is a colon at the end of line 10, which makes it sound like line 10 is separated from line 11. As a result, the entire last stanza is made up of end-stop lines, and this in turn slows readers down even more than the enjambment of the previous stanzas, urging them to truly imagine how delicious the plums were. By playing with this contrast between enjambed and end-stop lines, then, the speaker controls the rhythm and the pacing of the poem. This is especially important because the poem is so short. What's more, the poem's overall lack of metre means that the rhythmic quality of the line breaks is particularly significant, as this is one of the only tools the speaker can use to control the flow of words. Consonants. Because "this is just to say" doesn't contain many words, the small concentrated moments of consonants are especially noticeable. In fact, this is the case even though the kind of consonants the speaker uses isn't all that repetitive. For example, the N sound only appears twice in the first stanza, but it still contributes to the stanza's overall sound. This is partially because it creates a slant rhyme between the words eaten and in. I have eaten the plums that were in. Because the poem doesn't have a set rhyme scheme, this repetition of the N sound in the ends of the first and third lines is rather prominent. What's more, the TH sounds, the sounds, repeat 3 times in the first stanza, appearing as the first sound of lines 2, 3 and 4, the plums that were in the icebox. The repetition of the sound creates a pleasant form of consonance, one that reflects the speaker's satisfaction after having eaten the plums from the icebox. It's also worth noting that although the L and M sounds appear only once in the first stanza, that they create a slightly rounded sound that is quite pleasing. Alongside the consonant N and th sounds, this leads to euphony. In this way, the speaker's language invites readers to luxuriate in the same kind of satisfaction and pleasure that the speaker experiences after eating the plums. Furthermore, the poem also features subtle moments of sibilance, which is yet another kind of consonance. Indeed, the sibilant S sound pairs with the Z, th, sh, and F sounds to create an even more broader kind of sibilance. This is especially apparent in the final stanza. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. All in all, the sibilance accentuates the poem's musicality. Diacope. In the last two lines, so sweet, so cold, the speaker uses diacope to repeat the word so 2 times, ultimately emphasising just how satisfying it was to eat the chilled plums. This instance of diacope is especially prominent because it accentuates the sibilance that also appears in the final 2 lines, so sweet and so cold. By combining diacope and sibilance here, the speaker creates an extremely musical sound that aligns with the pleasure of eating plums directly out of the icebox or some other cold place. What's more, the word so is a particularly relevant one to repeat because it is used as an intensifier, thereby placing emphasis on the fact that the speaker derived an extraordinary amount of satisfaction from eating the plums, which weren't just sweet, they were cold. This, of course, is a subtle difference, but the fact remains that the word so, which is small and seemingly insignificant, modifies not only the way these lines sound, but the general perception of the speaker's experience. By using diacope in the poem's concluding lines, the speaker effectively invites readers to see the act of eating chilled plums as dazzlingly wonderful, not ordinary or mundane whatsoever. Thank you.